So Professor Bitek is an Acholi poet and an assistant professor of Black creativity at Queen's University. She holds a master's degree in English and a BFA in creative writing and a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from the University of British Columbia. Her work speaks to issues of home, homeland, exile, citizenship, and diaspora to reflect on the afterlife of violence. And she has a whole range of books of poetry and awards, very much in keeping with the work of the person who she will introduce. I really can't think of a better person to join us in really raising her voice to think about and pay homage to yet another sister, another colleague who has so profoundly shaped the kind of work that we do. And so I welcome you, Julie, to come to the stage and join us. So she'll start with a piece, spoken word piece that she wrote for Dionne, and then proceed through it to introduce Dionne, who will then follow and give her lecture for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamari. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Yes. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you very much, Christina, for that. I remember the first time I heard that what could a vessel be. I was like many people, not in Venice, but I was at YouTube listening to it, and I was held and held and held in goosebumps. So thank you for that. What it must be to be invited to introduce our Dionne brand to ourselves, as if we didn't know ours. But here I am, having taken the train from Kingston to Toronto for 2.5 hours to introduce a former poet laureate of Toronto, in Toronto, to Torontonians, in a city made legible by voices and presence of folks from here and from across this planet. A city loved and written by Dionne Brand, whose words are inscribed here on the walls, on the sidewalk, slabs, in notebooks, stuffed in pockets, and books in the backpacks of students and protesters and lovers. This city that Dionne Brand writes about as beauty, unbreakable, and amorous as eyelids. All of us looking to orientate ourselves in this place, in this time and ever so. By way of orientation and to name the ground I live in, the lands that have received us and taken care of us and held us. I live in Kingston, Katarokwe, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people. For the past 3 decades before that, I lived in Vancouver and the lands of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. And these lands witnessed me when people wouldn't, and I committed my work to out of solidarity and witness while I lived there. In the late 70s and through the 80s, first in Kenya and then in Uganda, we listened to the radio to know what was happening around us. Radio Deutsche Welle, Voice of America, and always the BBC. Always after the rest of the Western world had orientated itself as the center of their own news, we'd get elsewhere coming at us from journalists based miles away from us in Nairobi, Johannesburg, London, in an accent that our ears have been trained to listen to, in words through which we filtered through the usual vocabulary of jungle, war-torn, dictator, overthrow, military, junta, corruption, bombs, and third world, underdeveloped, to know again who was in power and who wasn't. And so, as I read A Map to the Door of No Return when it came out 20 years ago, I was struck by how Dionne Brand began with the memory, hers and mine too. Elsewhere, the BBC announces, and those of us in various diasporas and locales are tossed about in the windstorms of the periphery, where strange things happen, like the old-time maps with illustrations of weirdnesses beyond the discovered world. Elsewhere, elsewhere, elsewhere. A taxi driver in Toronto tells me that he's never been at a crossroad street in Toronto and heard a language spoken twice. We are of elsewhere. And by the end of that book, there's a bus rider, if you've read it. There used to be an Acholi man who drove a bus for BC Transit in Vancouver. His name was Mike Aziz, or Aziz Mike, depending on how you knew him. I'm on the bus in that last scene of the book, as we all are when we're invited into story. And I can hear the accent that Dionne writes about because I know his accent, and I know even more so, even as there are more and more buses in Kingston, where I live today, speak with accents that don't originate here. But to be lost, displaced, and disoriented is also a function of our ears being attuned to the radio and the voices on the TV, on CBC now speaking of us and where we're from as elsewhere. A map to the door of no return offered me a grammar, a clarification that disorientation is a function of the colonial endeavor, even in places that have long declared independence. We are reliant on the poets among us to show us the work of words, the fashioning of words, the possibilities, even from the same alphabet, the same linguistic root from which we can spell out our own thoughts, our presence as present, and our future that we want. And so when the COVID pandemic broke out in 2020, there was a mad rush to convince us that the voices, that things had never been so bad or so scary or so terrible. Normalize, the voices on radio and TV told us. Return to normal, where things were normal and life was normal and normal was fine and fine was good. But Dionne reminded us to interrogate what normal was and is, and how normal gathers both exceptionalism and an obliteration. Dionne has kept us company in film, poetry, and novels through wartime and weird time, reminding us, as she does in an autobiography of the autobiography of reading, with what is it then to adopt, to be indoctrinated into these narrative structures, those ideas, to come to know those ideas as your own when you are the negated other people. To claim normal, to work towards normal, is to accept the everyday negations of ourselves as whole people. It was never normal, Dionne reminded us. Normal, like nice, was always a scam for the rest of us. Wangapi tumeona, we used to say when someone tries to show up in an attempt to impress us with the idea of returning to normal. We were so cynical, and Swahili is a perfect language for cynicism. And Dionne Brand's Toronto Star article might as well have been titled, Wangapi tumeona, been there and we're still here. Here, in these days when we face anew the immensity of Gaza, a poem returns to me. Just after 2 decades ago, the government of Uganda gave their Acholi people 24 hours to leave their homelands and move to the city. The context was that the war that was ongoing between the government in Uganda and the Lord's Resistance Army, and 90% of the population moved in those 24 hours, creating a massive internal displaced camp where hurriedly built huts had roofs that almost touched. And every few days for a while, the huts would explode into fire and raise down hundreds and countless homes of people who had just been forcefully displaced from their homes. For a decade, folks languished in those camps, dying at one point at the rate of 1,000 a week, numbers that are incalculable for 1 million+ people who lived there. Elders and other knowledge keepers died with the records of family plots, and when the lucky folks returned, they found that their homes had been developed by those who declared the land abandoned. Firstborn sons. It was a glib slide, a quick pass, a little lift to the corner of the mouth, an almost smile. It was a quick look, a glib remark about places to live, to be saved, away from this darkness. It was a little lift to the corner of the mouth, a glib smile, a quick pass over no bloody cross at the door. It was an invitation. It was a bloody smile, a little lift of the curtain, a bleak passive spittle that flew over in an arc, hung in the air, burst into colorful stories of contested lands in faraway places. It was a little lift of the curtain, a bleak smile, past years and years of washing that faded in a bloody mark, which meant that the angel could stop. It was a quick pass, flames and flames licking thirst hearts as far as the eye could see. It was a sly remark. There are no new stories. When I read the novel Theory, when it came out in 2018, I was struck by just how closely it seemed to follow my own life, fictionalized, of course. I was deep in my doctoral work, and the rest of the world was worlding. I finished Theory and shook my head because the book ends with an invocation of the Father as an epistemological point, which helped me to understand how my father featured as more than a stubborn ghost in my dissertation. So when I told Dionne the Theory felt like the story of my life, she laughed a small laugh. Apparently I'm not the first one to make that claim. Fiction, Toni Morrison tells us, can be a space to claim sovereignty, to find a way to free the imagination of impositions and limitations that we live with. At the beginning of At the Fall and Change of the Moon, a family tree from which generations present come from a question mark. And Thisbe, a woman condemned to death, utters, "This is but a drop of water." And from there, a whole novel, Black Life, Black Thought, as Dionne says, as thought and not the unthought being the space of disorientation. This is a poem after Grace Boggs' fantastic question, what is the time on the clock of the world? I almost saw you today, almost you, sitting in a chair ahead of me, girl, intent on the presentation, and I on the almost you. And then the almost you turned, and the almost you wasn't you at all, just the back of your head, and nape and shoulder, and the memory of you, girl, shape-shifting. You are the skin of my back, girl, I tell you. You hold me together in this world of clocks, in this tired, pale world, this cold sun world, this heaving, this falling, this becoming that is not a becoming in the clock of the world. You hold me together, girl, even as one beyond my reach, even as the world comes to know the time, even as I hardly ever think of you. I ask my lovers, they try, they approximate, they want to help me, they do, but my body stills in unease because you are the skin of my back in the clock of this world. You hold me together, girl, even when you're not here. I ask the doctor, and they offer medication, and the priest offers prayer, and I ask at the registration desk, and they ask me to sign here, here, and here, and there's no relief in the dawn of the world. The dentist fixes a broken tooth. The insurer renews insurance. The grocery clerk hands me the receipt. If these are forever times, how will I know, since you're no longer here, since the pale sun insists on pretend daylight? But this is still the clock of the world, thanks be to God. I first heard nomenclature for the time being, like many in this room, at the R.W.B. Jackson lecture given in Zoom country in 2020, while we gathered and connected through our screens each day, an inventory like the persona of that book, counting, taking note, reminding us of what we are yet to come to know. From inventory, all the folded linen, all the broken fingers, pricked and bruised. Those of us who could gather by the TV while essential workers picked fruit, cut meat, took care of our infirm relatives and us, and stocked and kept grocery stores open, and obviously the liquor store and the cannabis store, because those two were essential. Nomenclature for the time being sounded and felt like a path to return to ourselves, especially in a time when we couldn't be with people. Then, as now, we are deeply aware of the horrors about us. And then we turn to inventory and thirsty and ossuaries, collections that for me orientate me to time and place. Later, at the loophole of retreat that Christina was just talking about in Venice, as Dionne got up to speak, she offered the perfect gift of a poem, silence. And then the bells began to go in the distance, like an announcement of another gift. And when we heard Dionne offer another exception of this gorgeous work, it arrived in text later, wrapped in the art of Tokwasi Dyson and momentary awe for its heft. I was grateful for the moment to slow down and be invited in by the steady and brilliant hand of Christina Sharp, who writes about Dionne Brand's poetry as something being worked out in relation to time, in time. In a conversation between Dionne Brand and David Neyman in between the covers, his insight is that the poet is always writing back to the self, whose deep disappointment for the failed revolution in Grenada. Dionne Brand laughs a small laugh again and admits that he's not wrong. And I think, yeah, time, and also the work of words, and also the impossibility of being ourselves, and yet here we are. In nomenclature for the time being, there's the new poem, the old, the selected, the blue poems, and ours. Here is Dionne Brand, ours, ours, and ours.
Silence is for you.